Hello and welcome to the Girls Fuel podcast. My name is Haley. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition coach here to help you along your health and fitness journey by providing evidence and experience-based knowledge. And as always, full transparency. So today, Jess and I are going to talk about a topic that I feel like we see a lot of content on online, and there's a lot of people that talk about it, but it's not fully understood. That topic is SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So, in this podcast, you can expect to understand what SIBO is. How do you know if you have it? We can't diagnose you with it, but we can teach you how to identify if that is part of your struggles. We're going to talk about how you can, quote unquote, because again, we are not doctors, treat or manage your SIBO and how to prevent reoccurrences, which do happen. So make sure you stay until the end of the episode so you can hear that part. But the first thing that we'll kick off with is, what are the main symptoms that we see when we find a client, when we find out one of our clients has SIBO? So Jess, I would love for you to kick that off for us.
Yeah, so two of the main ones that I've seen, number one is bloating. I think that's very commonly known that bloating, but pretty intense bloating, like I'm going to say like pregnant belly bloating, specifically right after you have a meal. Some people, specifically when they have carbs. So that's another thing. Food intolerances, but food intolerances to, okay, yes, dairy, maybe gluten, but also when I hear that someone is very intolerant to carbs, that's another big sign. This was something that I couldn't figure out. Like I couldn't have over 30 grams of carbs and I would just be like in a ball, like all night long. And it would happen like later on in the day. So that was a big sign. And then constipation, that is a really big one. I'm not sure, Haley, if you see diarrhea a lot, but constipation is one of the ones that I see a lot.
Yeah, definitely. With SIBO, again, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, there are three different types of SIBO. There's methane, there's hydrogen, and there's hydrogen sulfate, or HS2. It is very common to see a fluctuation between constipation and diarrhea when you have SIBO. Constipation is very common because a lot of times the reason why we get to that point where we do have that pregnancy level bloating is because we are so damn backed up that pressure is building and the belly is expanding. And we have another really big sign of SIBO. And this is how I knew that I had SIBO before I tested. This was years ago, is smelly gas.
Yes.
Specifically,
Yes.
yes,
Forgot.
this is something that a lot of clients will like talk to me about and be like, Haley, it is so embarrassing. Like my
Yeah.
farts, they smell like rotten eggs. They smelled like something crawled up in me and died. And that was my main GI symptom from a very early age. I thought it was freaking hysterical. But I also grew up in a family where my dad grew up with GI issues and it was very normalized. My dad would fart and it would smell of like fucking dead things and we would all laugh. I grew up normalizing that for myself, but realistically, your farts really on average shouldn't smell like anything. Like passing
Yeah.
gas is normal and it's something that's
Like
normal.
multiple times a day. I've heard, like when I read research, it's like you should be passing gas. Like it's not a cause of alarm unless it smells like dying bodies.
Yes, exactly. And that's where, especially if you are, like just mentioned, noticing an influx of these symptoms, whether it's the bloating, other
Hmm.
symptoms of SIBO, and we're going to talk about why this happens because, yeah, SIBO is bacterial overgrowth, bad bacteria in your small intestine where it doesn't belong, right? Most of the bacteria that lives in your gut microbiome and it needs to live there, it has a very important role, is in your large intestine. And that bacteria helps us absorb and also produce vitamins and minerals, right? But our small intestine, that is where the biggest part of digestion occurs. That's where enzymes from the pancreas are entering, where bile from the liver is coming in for fat digestion, and where a lot of your breakdown of food is happening. So when we have extra bad bacteria in that space, you are going to have a wide array of symptoms because it is interrupting your body's ability to just digest your foods. Those are the basic GI symptoms that we mentioned: bloating, gas, constipation, diarrhea. But we also see a lot of nausea, low appetite. Again, if you're
Hmm.
not digesting your food and it's fermenting inside of you, that's part of SIBO. The bacteria ferments and it produces that gas, it produces more bad bacteria and it impacts other systems of your body. because it's very inflammatory. So that's where we may also see fatigue. We may see joint pain. We'll see acne or rosacea. We'll see depression and anxiety. Because if you haven't gotten this already from listening to our podcast, the gut is literally the center of everything. And when something like a SIBO or dysbiosis, which we'll talk about what that means in a second, is present, it is going to impair basically every aspect of how you feel, whether you realize it or not. So that's where we mentioned dysbiosis. And I'm sure you've heard this online too, where people will be like, oh, it's just dysbiosis, or oh, is it SIBO or is it dysbiosis?
Yeah.
What really is the difference? Dysbiosis basically means that there is a dysregulation of good and bad bacteria. And this is something that we usually see in like a GI map stool test because that shows exact types of bacteria that are mainly in your large intestine, but we can also attribute that to overgrowth in our small intestine. Dysbiosis is different from SIBO because just because you have certain bacteria that are low or high, they may not be SIBO fermentable bacterias. This is where we'll get into testing in a little while, but this is where, if you're a coach listening to this, and you do use the GI map in your practice, this is where understanding what the different bacterias that might be
Mm.
positive or higher or versus lower actually mean, right? And I can even give you a few different examples of opportunistic or bad bacterias that we might see in the GI map that show me that you may have SIBO. Because again, the GI map cannot diagnose or
No.
definitively tell us that you have SIBO because that is a picture of your large intestine, not your small. But I've been doing this long enough to know that there's enough research that backs these specific bacterias and if what they're linked to in regards to the different types of SIBO. With hydrogen producing bacteria, we'll see our Bacillus spp. We'll see the Enterococcus family, Staphylococcus, and Streptococcus. I would say the Staphylococcus spp and the Streptococcus are the most common overgrowths that we see. They're very inflammatory. They show that you have poor digestive health, and they also can be indicative of SIBO. And then we have our methane producing bacteria. These are not very well represented on the GI map, and it's very rare that I see these overgrown. However, on the GI map in the opportunistic overgrowth section, this is where you'll see it under commensal overgrowth. So basically, what that means is commensal. Those are our good guys. But when they're overgrown, it's a red flag. It's a bad thing. And those, I'm going to butcher pronouncing these, but those are our methanobacteria family. Pretty easy to tell. Methano, methane. And those are normal in the distal colon in our large intestine, but they can be problematic when they're in our large. And methane SIBO is more correlated to constipation versus hydrogen sulfide. They is more diarrhea dominant, right? So you get the idea there. The way that you could get a true diagnosis for SIBO, and we're going to talk about what you should do as far as getting rid of it in a minute. But the kind of gold standard test for SIBO is a breath test. And basically, you can get a lot of times you can get this at your doctor. So, this is where you will be given a substrate solution to drink. Usually it's lactulose or glucose. You can request one over the other if you know that you have bad things happen when you consume one over the other. You consume it, and then every so many minutes, hours, you breathe into a bag and it collects your air sample, your breath sample. And from there, the lab will compare your samples to a baseline, and they're looking to see how much fermentation is happening. So after you drink, whether it's the glucose or the lactulose, if you have SIBO, we will see either a rise in the hydrogen gas, a rise in the methane, or a rise in the hydrogen sulfate. That is the main mode that doctors will use to evaluate SIBO. That is also something that we order for our clients if we want to be definitively sure that is what is causing their symptoms. However, more often than not, I opt for the GI map when I suspect SIBO.
Mm.
And the reason is just because the GI map shows us so much more than whether you're positive for SIBO or not. or whether you have bad bacteria overgrowth or not, right? Because a lot of times, and this goes into what causes SIBO, it's not just SIBO that's wrong, because SIBO doesn't just get there. We don't just wake up one day and we're unable to digest fibers. We're unable to eat carbs without blowing up the room with gas. It occurs due to impaired GI health, and the GI map helps us see exactly why that might be happening. So we'll go into a little bit more about like how SIBO impacts us in a minute. But Jess, I would love for you to dive into what causes SIBO to develop, thinking about GI integrity, but also just other things in life that might be making you more susceptible.
Yeah, I want to go as far as saying people always, well, I looked for this one factor that caused my SIBO. It's usually multiple. So you have to think very holistically about your life, your history, things like that. But some of the ones that are common, some common causes of SIBO, definitely to start just impaired gut motility. So if someone is very constipated, their risk of getting SIBO will definitely be higher. Structural abnormalities. So when I say that, I mean like surgeries, for example. We see this a lot. Like I've seen this after pregnancy. Definitely, like we've seen that a lot. And I've also had surgery before as well. Specifically, I got a breast augmentation and had a ton of gut issues after. Obviously, this is going to depend on the person, where the surgery is and things like that. But that was one. Surgeries and things like that is a common one as well. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Haley, about structural abnormalities?
Don't you have something wrong with your colon?
Oh,
You forget because it's not an
yes.
issue for you anymore.
I know, I know. Oh my God, I do forget. Okay, I was actually diagnosed with this with a redundant colon. So when I was doing all of my testing with multiple doctors, they did a colonoscopy and endoscopy, and they found out that my colon basically means that it's extra long, which means that it whines and it turns. And so they told me that I would have constipation for the rest of my life and would need to be on medication, or that I needed surgery to cut it basically and make it shorter. And I've never heard another person having this before. It's mostly genetic. Also, it can form when you're a kid. I don't know. It's crazy, but I haven't heard anyone else who has been diagnosed with this. But anyways, I do not need medication and I reversed all my symptoms. But also dysfunctional immune system. So if you're always sick as a kid, if you're always sick, basically low immune function. Another big one is medications. The big one is PPI, antibiotics, things like that. Changes in gut flora, big one. Poor diet. I had a very poor diet when I was a kid. I think that caused me a lot of risk to get SIBO. Antibiotic overuse. Also was on a ton of antibiotics when I was a kid, especially if you are not supporting your gut flora when you are on antibiotics. That is a really big one that I support a lot of my clients with as well. Stress. Stress is always big one here too. Health conditions like celiac and diabetes, decreased pancreatic function. We talk a lot about decreased enzymes, digestive enzyme, bile, stomach acid, things like that. And low stomach acid is also a huge risk factor as well. Food intolerances and age-related changes. So as you get older, motility can change. That's a big one. Your gut flora, your entire microbiota, it can change as you age as well.
No, definitely. And the big thing to think about when we're assessing risk factors is your bowel motility. That is like order of business number one. You need to be
Yes.
pooping, right? If you are constipated, you are so much more likely to develop a bacterial overgrowth. And I don't say this to scare you, but the reality is the longer that the food sits inside of you, the more that it is able to ferment. That fermentation is what births these bad bacterias. So that's where a lot of the things that Jess mentioned can lead to constipation. Another big risk factor that Jess really highlighted was the low stomach acid. And this is a big factor in preventing the relapse of bacterial overgrowth. And this is where we'll talk later about why antibiotics aren't always effective for SIBO. Because if, you're having low stomach acid, if you have leaky gut, if you have all of this inflammation in your body, because all you're doing is taking antibiotics and you're not fixing all of these other issues or the other downregulated aspects of your gut health, it is just going to come back. And that's where your gut holds such a large portion of your immune system. Your stomach
Mm,
acid is part of your immune system. If it's low, which we see all the time, a big sign to look out for that's often early for people that they see before they are like, oh gosh, I probably have full blown SIBO, is low stomach acid, which can come with nausea, having a
yeah,
low appetite, feeling like you can't finish your meals. Maybe protein is giving you the ick. You're
yeah,
bloated at the end of the day. You get a little bloated after certain meals. And if you don't have sufficient levels of stomach acid, your body can't properly fight off pathogens. It can't neutralize bad bacteria and balance that microbiome. And it can't absorb food properly. So that's where, like with our clients at Girls Fuel, we take a very root cause centered approach. And it's not just, oh, the root cause is SIBO, because it's
yeah,
not. We want to know, why do you have SIBO so we can make sure you never get it again? Because getting a reoccurrence of a GI overgrowth
yeah.
or bacterial dysbiosis is very common if you don't go about getting rid of it the right way.
I heard of research, and I don't quote me, but it was a very high percentage of low stomach acid cases developing or is the cause for SIBO. And it was like 70%
Yeah,
cases. And obviously, multiple things can be at play, but stomach acid is, I'd say, one of the biggest ones.
for sure. And that's where too, another thing that we'll look at in our clients that do have SIBO is how their other organ systems are functioning, right? Because some of the most common conditions that we see increase the risk of something like SIBO and fostering an environment for that bad bacteria to thrive are hypothyroidism, sluggish thyroid function, and insulin resistance. So that could also be diabetes, prediabetes, right? And the reason being, both of these things, the hypothyroidism and the insulin resistance, cause altered GI motility, mainly constipation. However, for some people, they may also experience diarrhea, just depending on what the health of their GI tract is, right? When we have insulin resistance and we have this extra amount of blood sugar, blood glucose floating around in our
Yeah.
bloodstream, that raises inflammation in the body. It raises oxidative stress, and that stress not only increases intestinal permeability, meaning it heightens the sensitivity of your GI lining by causing leaky gut. So the tight junctions in your intestines are not so tight anymore. They're wide open and allowing for food particles, different pathogens, toxins, and other
Mm,
things that aren't supposed to be able to cross. So not only is that causing acute inflammation of the lining, but it's going through to the bloodstream. And that is where the majority of our immune system lies. When these things, food particles, pathogens, bacteria particles, even little bits of bile, enter our bloodstream, that causes our body to throw up the alarms because it's, hey, these are foreign invaders, even though the body should know what those things are because the body produces a lot of them. It doesn't, because they don't belong there. So the body sends out the red alarms, and that's where immune function becomes weakened. Because instead of your immune system, all of your special forces trying to just keep you from getting sick from the snot that your kid just brought home and wiped on your shirt, it is busy fighting the pathogens that are going through your bloodstream from your GI tract. So that's where, when we have a client that has SIBO or just really has any GI issue. Again, we use a very symptom-based approach. So you've probably seen us talk about all of our questionnaires. That way we can specifically tell you if your symptoms sound like leaky gut or intestinal permeability versus low stomach acid. And we support those things first. Because if you do not mend the lining of your gut, you are not going to get rid of your SIBO. That is another big aspect of how insulin resistance impacts our body. If you're insulin resistant, you're
mm,
more likely to have that leaky gut. It also negatively impacts liver and bile acid function. So, as a result of insulin resistance, we can develop a condition called non alcoholic fatty liver. This disrupts secretions like bile acids, which not only help regulate the bacteria in the small intestine, but it also helps with the absorption of our food, right? So, when all of these different things are out of whack in our body, when systems are slowed down, when constipation
mm,
is occurring, and when our metabolism is slower, because our
mm.
thyroid is essentially our metabolic gas tank. If your metabolism or your thyroid function is slower, everything is slower. And that's what a lot of people don't realize about the thyroid is It regulates and controls everything. It's not just there to
Yeah.
help you lose or gain or maintain your weight. It controls body temperature. It controls heart
Your
rate.
whole,
It regulates your sex hormones, so your periods, your
yeah.
testosterone levels. It also helps regulate blood sugar because, again, when one system is off, it is triggering a stress response in the body and other systems
Yeah.
are off as a result. So this is like the main reason why at Girls Fuel we do take such a holistic approach. And by holistic, I just mean looking at all of the body systems together and connecting the dots and putting the puzzle pieces together. So anytime we see in somebody's blood work that maybe there's hypothyroidism, maybe we see that insulin resistance, and those are things that we really make sure we look at. We are just really educating them about how they can also support their GI health to prevent something like this bad bacterial overgrowth to happen. And Jess, I feel like thinking about the management of SIBO, one thing that I see a lot of comments about online are, do I have to avoid carbs if I have SIBO? Or what is the best diet for SIBO? Jess, I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit more about that and specifically what we typically do as our approach with Girls Fuel for managing something like a bacterial overgrowth.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting because I feel like after SIBO diets, people are so scared to bring back in carbs. And the biggest thing is, okay, these diets are short term and they're not going to heal your SIBO. They're only going to manage your symptoms, right? Until we get in there and use whatever it is that we're going to use to treat SIBO, obviously not doctors. First thing that you can use is the low FODMAP. So there's lots of apps that we use with our clients to figure out what foods are low and high FODMAP. And for example, like 30 grams of an avocado is low FODMAP. That's like literally this much avocado, right? So like paying attention to what's low and high, but also taking a personalized approach and thinking, okay, like what personally bothers you. So for me, like all the fermentable foods, like beans, peppers were a big one, like onion, garlic, those were ones that really impacted me. And yeah, so look is the first thing to try. Haley, would you add anything to that?
Yeah. So low FODMAP, basically what this does is it targets the removal of highly fermentable carbohydrates. FODMAP, what that stands for is fermentable, oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyols. These are all just components of the carbohydrate starch that are typically poorly absorbed in the GI tract. So when we have a bacterial overgrowth, these are foods that are very easy to ferment so that bacteria can feed on them and it can produce more symptoms. So that's where I just mentioned a lot of the most common food triggers being beans, being onions and garlic and
Mm,
broccoli. That's why you feel like you might eat things and everything causes bloating and gas.
yeah.
That's because almost everything is cooked with garlic and onion. Those are yeah, that's why.
And the one thing is when I had a client actually a month ago. We haven't done testing yet, but she had sauerkraut and it
Oh, no.
screwed her for 3 days. Oh, wow. Certain foods are going to impact you more than others. But like when I see the sauerkraut thing, it's like fermentable carbohydrates, sauerkraut, kimchi, things like that. And it's funny because everyone says, oh, these are good for gut health. Okay. Only in certain situations when you have a healthy gut. But when SIBO is present, it's going to make things a lot worse.
Yeah, and that's where I see a lot of accounts online, and there's no shame in the game. If they get results from
Mm-mm.
people following this diet long term, I honestly can't agree with that at all. I can't agree with that at all. So there are IBS accounts or SIBO accounts that say just stay low FODMAP forever. You don't have to do that. I don't know about you, but I have
No.
done low FODMAP for a very long time because when I had SIBO, I
Yeah.
also had candida and I had a lot of dysbiosis, a lot. So I was low FODMAP for 6 months. And after that, I was like, I am never doing this ever again. It wasn't that bad. And we really helped our clients make it livable, but it
Yeah.
does cut out a big portion of foods, mainly again, different fruits and
Yeah.
veggies, different carbs, different seasonings, even sauces and things of that nature. And it is pretty restrictive. How this is one of the biggest lines of defense when we are getting rid
Yeah.
of the overgrowth, which we're going to get to how you actually get rid of it. The diet alone will not get rid of it. So that's why if you're someone that's tried low FODMAP and it didn't work, that's because you didn't kill the overgrowth. It's still there. So you add the FODMAPs back in, or you go out to eat and you're like, I'm going to be normal tonight, and you feel like shit. That is why. So low FODMAP is good to do for a period of time while you are purposely getting rid of the main issue. And the
Yeah.
approach that we take is very customized, right? We'll go through the
Yeah.
elimination phase where we're like, hey, these are the foods that are low FODMAP, these are the foods that are high.
Mm,
And I actually give my clients a printable list that has each on one on each side. And
yeah.
I say, hey, print this out, take a highlighter. On the low FODMAP side, which are the safe foods, highlight the ones that you like or that you eat now. On the high side, which right now are the ones we want to limit or avoid, highlight the ones that you're currently eating and just swap across. So if you usually eat broccoli, can we eat green beans, for example? So the elimination is where we start. From there, as we're actually chipping away at the overgrowth, which we'll get to, we will slowly start reintroducing foods. So that way, quality of life gets a little easier, where we're testing the waters and seeing, is the overgrowth gone? And then that's where the personalization comes in, because not every single person reacts negatively to every single FODMAP. So if again, to summarize that, if there is an account online that's telling you to do low FODMAP for the rest of your life, please don't. Please don't follow them.
And if the account says no carbs at all, I feel like we skipped over that part. I have clients come into me, I can't eat a single carb. And it's just like, okay, but you can still eat carbs.
Yes.
Fermentable carbohydrates and carbs in general, they're two different things, right?
Yes, I honestly don't think I've ever had a client go significantly low
Yeah.
carb for SIBO, especially if they're active, right? Like I know when I did
Yes.
low FODMAP, I was eating 200 grams of carbs a day, which if you track your macros, like that's a good amount. The big thing again is just sticking with the low FODMAP carbs. So for example, technically rice is considered lower FODMAP. It's going to be
Yeah.
easier to digest. Again, if you have a blood sugar issue, then we may just have to be a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
Potatoes are
Sweet
totally
potatoes. I lived
fair.
on sweet potatoes when I was
Yep.
on a low FODMAP.
Sweet potatoes,
Squash.
squash, pumpkin, things of that
Yeah.
nature, different
Those are
vegetables,
great.
different types. Like I always give my clients a list of like gluten-free breads that are safe and
Yeah.
different dairy alternatives that are safe, vegetables that are safe, even like convenience foods like bars and chips and baked goods. There is a lot, especially now. Another approach that some practitioners will take with SIBO is a specific carb diet. This restricts all complex carbohydrates. I have never had
Yeah.
to use this with someone. The only time I probably would is if it was a very severe case with a lot of blood sugar dysregulation. This
Mm,
is much more rigid and long term. This is something that people will use for Crohn's disease or other like IBD like conditions. Again, it really is customized to where you're at, not only with your symptoms, but also with your lifestyle. If you are someone that eats out with your family and goes to sports games every other night because you're caught your kids around, it's probably not going to be realistic for you to avoid every single food. And that's where we really work with you to customize it. But the biggest thing that you need to be doing while you're doing the elimination diet is eradicating the infection. And this is where people miss the mark because they just follow the elimination diet or they try a new
mm,
probiotic, which that is a question that we have come up a lot is, are probiotics bad for SIBO? The answer is yes and no. Because SIBO is fermenting things in your gut. A lot of bacteria strains are easily fermentable, like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. So those are ones that I recommend avoiding when you are dealing with an overgrowth. This is also where we get clients coming to us that say probiotics make me feel bloated, they make me feel worse. That is a sign that you have SIBO. Because more often than not, if you search Amazon for probiotic, you're going to get one of
yeah.
those blends that has those bacteria strains. We need those strains, but not until after we get rid of the infection. So there are specific probiotics that we recommend for our clients during the kill off that are resistant to the breakdown that we're trying to work through for the bacteria or the harsh effects of the antibiotic. And these are typically going to be a Saccharomyces or a spore-based bacteria because these cannot
Yeah.
contribute to the overgrowth. Probiotic wisely. But when it comes to getting rid of, I can't say treating because I'm not a doctor, even though I kind of
Right.
wish I was. I'm going to go back to med school. I joke with Ed about that all the time. He was like, do you really want to? I was like, if I didn't want kids, I would go back to med school just so I could be like an actual functional doctor.
Your nutrition doctor, Haley.
Kind of.
Dietitian.
No doctoring. Anyway, yes, why don't we chat about the typical lines of treatment for SIBO, especially let's start with what doctors would do if you come to them and you do a breath test. Honestly, I've had doctors recommend this without the breath test if the client comes to them with the
Oh.
bloating, the gas. So what do you usually see there?
So it's going to depend on the client and what they want to do. So sometimes you can use herbal antimicrobials. However, you're going to have to be more strict with your diet if you want to take that approach. And it might take longer. It actually will take longer. The other approach is going through your doctor. So, yes, going to the doctor, doing the SIBO breath test. If it's a yes, they're going to suggest antibiotics. And I think they use, and there's some listed here. Do you know if they use, I'm pretty sure they use three different ones at the same time. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Um,
Not always, but sometimes they will. Yeah. Sometimes they'll use three different antibiotics as a
yes,
combination, but the most
a
common one is
combination.
probably rifamycin that I see.
Mm,
Doxycycline is another one. And these are just like antibiotics that target bacteria. So you might have
yeah.
had these antibiotics for another reason, and that's why you might be someone that took antibiotics for UTI, which UTI can be a gut symptom, which we'll get to in another episode. You might have taken an antibiotic for UTI and your gut got better. So that's where doctors will usually prescribe antibiotics. But like just mentioned, typically with our clients, we'll take more of an herbal natural approach. Is one better than the other? It really depends on what else is going on in your GI tract. One of the main reasons that a lot of our clients opt to go herbal is because we find other issues, right? So if we're
Yeah.
using the GI map, we might see the bad bacteria overgrowth, but we might also see a candida, which is a fungal overgrowth. We might also see an H. pylori, which is a different type of bacteria. We might see a SIBO. So this is where herbals can be really effective because they're very customizable to your specific situation and your specific symptoms. They are also thought to be less harsh. However, both do negatively impact your good gut bugs. That's why working with a practitioner is really helpful while you're going through this. Because if you take antibiotics alone, it's going to get rid of the bacteria, but it's not going to support everything else. So that's where we often find, like we talked about earlier, clients need support with low stomach acid. They also need to support enzyme production. They need to be supporting their ability to digest certain foods like dietary fats. And if you're not doing that, then you're just going to end up back where you started. But just with the clients that you've taken through different herbal protocols, whether it was SIBO or I know you have a couple right now that are parasites, what does that typically look like?
Yeah, so typically you'll probably start with 8 to 12 weeks on a herbal protocol. And yeah, it's going to be a little bit more strict than, say, antibiotics. Food will be more important to be gluten and dairy free, usually. No alcohol. Some of the more, so in the States, you guys have a great herbal blend that we use, and that is the biocidin. And it is a blend of herbs. However, in Canada, we don't really have access to that. So you may need to rely on single ingredient herbs. However, like this needs to be personalized depending on the person and how reactive you are. And is specifically, okay, looking at these single ingredients and how high the dose is in each capsule. I've seen so many times, I did it myself, where I went through a protocol and the herb blend was too high. The amount of each herb was too high. And it would just make me so sick, which is why I love the biocidin because 8 to 12 weeks, you gauge symptoms. Sometimes with SIBO, it might be a little bit more tricky to heal than, say, for example, something like H. pylori. However, like they can be trickier. You might have to do another round of of herbals. And so that's usually the approach is a little bit more strict than the antibiotics, which you're going to be on for 10 to 14 days, should be cleared after that. And then we support with a repopulation of good bacteria in the gut, which is like the most important part of this protocol.
Definitely. Yeah. And I feel like over the last couple of years that I've been doing this, and Jess is a little bit newer to doing this, and that's
Yeah.
where I do mentor her and oversee a lot of her
Yeah.
client protocols. I don't know if you've had a true SIBO protocol with us yet.
No, I
No.
haven't.
So that's where over the years, I have done this with so many clients that have struggled with the diet, especially. And you really don't have to be as rigid with it as you think you do. So that's where it really does come down to what is realistic for the person. And we take an
Yeah.
approach where it is more addition over subtraction. But with the herbal antimicrobials, I often find that these are preferred by our clients because they feel like
Yeah.
they are noticing gradual improvements along the way. And a lot of times when we're creating the protocols for them, we're choosing herbs that help with other things, right? So if somebody has a weakened immune function, but they're also showing that they have more hydrogen dominant bacteria, we're going to use a garlic versus something else for their support. Maybe they're also presenting with insulin resistance, and we might use a berberine. You're also going to want to make sure, again, that we're supporting those other systems of the body. So that comes down to immune function, it comes down to inflammation, it comes down to liver, and then it also comes down to mindset and self care.
Right. I
Because
like
a
that.
big reason why we ended up here with all these gut issues in the first place is because we weren't prioritizing ourselves. We weren't sleeping enough. We were too stressed out. We're eating in a rush. We're eating processed foods, and shit happens. But one of the big pieces of our coaching program is really helping our client build what a well-rounded, healthy lifestyle means to them. And that is one of the biggest things that you can do in order to prevent your GI issues from coming back and reoccurring. Does having SIBO mean you'll have digestive issues forever? That is a question that I get all the time. I feel like you probably know the answer to this if you've listened to this whole episode, but hard no. No. Just because you get diagnosed with IBS, or maybe you even got a diagnosis of SIBO, that doesn't mean that it's going to be there forever, because there is so much that you can do to get rid of that issue and support the shit out of your body and your mindset and your lifestyle. So that way it doesn't happen again. Jess, did you have anything to add to that?
I just wanted to ask a question just out of my experience. So I 100% had SIBO, and I didn't take any antimicrobials or anything. And over the years, when I was healing my gut, changing my lifestyle, I think that I like reversed my SIBO from like just this change in lifestyle. And yes, I built something that worked for me in terms of my nutrition and things like that. And so my question is, if someone has SIBO, can it go away without herbals, with a good life, with a change in lifestyle, nutrition habit, physical activity, things like that?
Yeah, I'm definitely. It's more likely that you had what we'd consider dysbiosis rather than SIBO.
Yes.
Because if
SIBO,
we
yeah.
think about, well, why did you get that? If you were reversing those root causes, be that,
Yeah.
poor diet quality, maybe overuse of alcohol, antibiotics, all of that stuff,
Yes.
we can assume that your good gut bugs that are protective were really low. And if you started eating more of a well-rounded
Yeah.
diet and probably taking some supplements to support, you got those back up and those are protective. You probably also had low stomach acid. Knowing you were
Yes.
probably doing the apple cider vinegar to get stomach acid up. You were taking
Oh
enzymes.
yeah.
You were eating foods that help you produce enzymes like pineapples and papayas and different bitter greens. So you're
Yep.
helping your body produce. And that's another reason, another place I see a lot of coaches go wrong reading a GI map is they'll see one or two bacterias be overgrown. And even if you see that, oh, balloons, it doesn't mean you have to go in with aggressive killers. Because there are times where I see this a lot with clients that come to me and they're like, I did an herbal protocol or I did a parasite cleanse on my own and I felt better and then I felt worse. And that's probably because, and maybe this was the case for you, Jess, you did have a
Yeah.
little bit of overgrowth, but in reality, you had low good bacteria. So by
Yeah.
doing the kill off, doing the herbs like the oregano and the garlic and the whatever it is
Yeah.
for the antibiotic, you made that worse. So, well,
Yeah.
yeah, you might have got rid of the bad. The good is even worse off now,
Off.
and you're
Yeah.
very susceptible for it to come back. So, that's where,
Exactly.
again, working with somebody that knows how to read the test or even read your symptoms is really important. And just your example of you fixing your gut without doing a kill off at that time is exactly what we do with our clients in the first few months. We're trying to do as
Yeah.
much as we can without going towards these
Using.
aggressive herbs that can cause some negative changes to the gut microbiome. But again, at this point, I've taken so many people through protocols like this that when we are going through the kill off, it's very easy for us to tell when we need to ease things back, when we need to get more aggressive, when we need more support. So that way you can come out of it feeling a lot better than you did going in.
I love that.
Cool. Awesome. So hopefully this episode was helpful. And again, big takeaway is everybody's journey with healing their gut is different. Whether you have SIBO or not, it's going to look different for everybody. The timeline, the dietary changes, the supplement recommendations, it's all going to be very individualized to you. So if you think that you might be struggling with SIBO or bacterial overgrowth after listening to this podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you liked this episode, please make sure you subscribe, share it with a friend, and thank you so much for hanging out with us today.